Good evening, I'm Harold Pachios. We're on the air again with another edition of Pachios on the News, and tonight we have your Senator Angus King as our guest. Angus, welcome.
Always a pleasure, Harold. Good to see you.
And we asked Angus to come by and talk to us about what's happening in Washington. All of us, no matter where you are in the political spectrum, you read the newspapers and you read about gridlock in Congress and you say, oh no, although some people do like gridlock. But you say, oh my God, what's happening? Well, so Angus, we're going to ask you a few questions and see if you can shed some light on it. You know, I want to begin with a very broad question and one that you uniquely qualified to answer. You're one of the few members of the United States Senate that actually worked at one time as a staff member.
That's right.
And you were in the 1970s?
Yes, exactly.
So, and I think that Mitch McConnell is another one.
That's right. Mitch McConnell and Susan Collins.
Oh.
She worked in the 80s for Bill Cohen. That's
right. So there's 3 or 4 of you that were staffers. So as you look back on the modern history of the Senate, and from your perspective as a United States Senator, what's changed?
Well, there are a lot of things. Surprisingly, Harold, one of the things that I've noticed, and I thought a lot about this, why did it work better in those days than it does today? One of the things is the Senate schedule. Sounds weird, but I think it's had a profound effect on how the place works. Here's why. The first vote, when we have to be there in Washington, is Monday afternoon after 5. The last vote of the week is usually Thursday afternoon about 1:30 or 2. So what do you suppose happens? Everybody goes to the airport Thursday afternoon and goes home for Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and then comes back. In other words, we're not there very much. And for that reason, there aren't relationships and friendships that I saw back in the days when you had Ed Muskie and Bill Hathaway and Mike Mansfield and the people that were in the Senate in those days. They all lived there. Their families were there. Muskie lived in Chevy Chase. Bill Hathaway lived in McLean. And they got together on weekends with their colleagues on a bipartisan basis. They went to ball games, kids' shows, all that kind of thing. Now, we literally don't know each other. And it's because our constituents like seeing us at home, number one. Number two, transportation is a lot easier than it was in terms of frequent airfare. I can be up here from Washington in an hour and a half. So, but the problem is it's made it difficult to form personal relationships. And you know, you've been around this business for a long time. I used to say to people, the relationship has to come before the ask. In other words, if you're going to work on something, particularly something that's controversial or difficult, you have to have a relationship first, you have to have trust, and that's what's missing. And believe it or not, the only bipartisan event of the week, other than official committee meetings, is the Wednesday morning prayer breakfast. It's my favorite hour of the week because A, it's a quiet moment in the midst of all the craziness. Secondly, it's an opportunity to just be in a bipartisan setting. And third, each week a different senator speaks ostensibly about their faith, but it's always autobiographical. In other words, it's an opportunity to learn something about your colleagues. And I see this as one of the reasons it's so hard to make the place work.
So you told me one time that you make an effort to get to know colleagues, that you invite them over for barbecue.
I do. My office, and we sort of went into a pause during COVID, but we're getting back into it. Claire Bridgeau in my office will call around the Senate randomly. We'll find 4 or 5 senators, always bipartisan. I pick up ribs, beans, and coleslaw on the way home to our to our little house. Mary and I bought a house about 8 blocks from the Capitol. I say little, it's 908 square feet. And the reason I emphasize that is there was a story in one of the Washington papers about these rib dinners, and they said it was 9,080 square feet.
So you need to correct that.
No, I want to correct that. 908 square feet. Anyway, and it's just an opportunity to have people get to know each other. I've had Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell, Ted Cruz, Dick Durbin, John Tester. I've had about 55 or 60 of the senators at one time or another.
You had McConnell at your place?
Yeah, absolutely. And I had McConnell, I think it was with Tammy Baldwin and a couple of others. Tammy is a pretty progressive Democrat from Wisconsin. And I could almost see Mitch saying, wow, she doesn't have horns, she's not crazy. I mean, and we all have the common experience of campaigns, and it's just a way to get to know each other. It's my own little project to overcome this problem of relationships.
So it seems to me that the other big difference is ideology. That we have a lot more ideologues get elected to Congress these days than back in the 70s. Although in the 70s, I was there in the 60s, all during the 60s, and of course the ideologues were really one issue. Ideologues, it was race, and there was Southern Democrats, and their issue was they could find a racial issue in every issue that arose.
Well, one of the problems now, and I think you put your finger on it, Harold, is the primary system. And the problem is only the average turnout for a primary across the country is 21% of the voters of that party. So if you're in a red state or a blue state or a heavily gerrymandered House district, one way or the other, the primary is the election. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter about November. If you get the Republican nomination to be member of Congress from the panhandle of Florida, for example, if you have a pulse, you're going to be elected to Congress. So the key, the really crucial election is the primary, but who votes in the primary? The most ideologically committed, the strongest. Now, right now, on the Democratic side, the most progressive. On the Republican side, the most Trumpist. So the result is there's no place for a moderate in that scenario. In fact, here's what's really disturbing, Harold. You can now lose your primary, not because of your position on immigration or Ukraine or abortion or anything else. You can lose your primary because you're not viewed as sufficiently hostile to the other side. If you're a person who's likely to listen and negotiate and compromise, you're a dead duck in a primary. And so the result is, and I've seen it in the Senate, we're losing the center. I can go down a list of 7 or 8 Republican senators that we've lost in the last 3 or 4 years, all of whom have been replaced by people much further to the right, much less likely to work things out. I think of Lamar Alexander, Roy Blunt, Richard Burr, people that tried to work from the center. Rob Portman of Ohio, all gone. This year we're losing Manchin and Sinema and Mitt Romney. And the problem is you get this situation where people are literally afraid to talk to each other and reach the kind of compromise that's necessary to solve any of these problems.
I'm going to ask you to make another comparison with earlier days in the Senate in a minute, but you remind me, those 3 are leaving, Romney, Sinema, Manchin, and then I read about a guy from North Dakota, Todd Young.
Indiana.
He's
a good guy.
Yeah. And he's willing to talk to people.
That's right. And there's still, I'm not saying there are none of these folks left, but here's an interesting number. When we had the original vote on the Ukraine supplemental, there were 22 Republicans that voted for it, okay? We had 70 votes. It was a really strong vote, which is terrific, bipartisan. But of those 22, only 2 were Republicans elected since 2018, and one of them was Romney. In other words, the newer people are getting further and further away from trying to work things out and get problems solved. And you know what happened to James Langford on the border bill, where they just hung him out to dry.
Well, he got threats. People called him out. This is a guy from where, Oklahoma?
He's he's probably the most conservative guy in the Senate in a true ideological sense.
Right.
I also think he's the smartest guy in the Senate. He has the highest IQ. Harold, he was on his high school debate team when he was in the 4th grade. I mean, this is a brilliant guy.
Yeah.
He was asked by the Republican caucus to negotiate a border bill, which he did over 4 months with Chris Murphy and Sinema. Chris Murphy's a Democratic senator from Connecticut. And they came up with the toughest border security bill in 40 years. And in about 2 days, the former president said, we don't want to do this. We don't want to give Biden a victory on the border. We want to keep this for November. And it just disappeared.
I'm going to get to, we're going to talk about the border security bill in a minute.
Yeah, we'll get to
I do want to talk about it. But back to this change. I remember the days when Iowa and the Dakotas, they had Democrats.
20 years ago, Nebraska and the 2 Dakotas there were 6 Democratic senators, all gone. Not even a prayer.
So that has nothing to do with what people in the Senate do, senators, leaders, political leaders. That has to do with the voters.
Yeah, that's right.
The voters are brought this gridlock. They're demanding it.
Well, people say, why is the Senate so gridlocked? And I say, because the public is gridlocked.
Correct.
And that gets back to the media and the fact that we're now all in our own separate media universes, where if you're a liberal, you watch Rachel Maddow and MSNBC. If you're conservative, you watch Fox News or One American Network. And then, of course, social media with the algorithms, they're literally pushing us apart. But if you stop and think about it, you watch either Fox News or MSNBC for a couple of hours, and you realize that what they're really selling is anger. And that's what keeps people watching, and it's what's pushing us apart. Obama once said if he watched Fox News for a week, he'd hate himself. So that's, and we can't, it's a free country, we have the First Amendment, but it's a shame that we don't have a better grasp of getting a diversity of views in terms of the news. I get my news on my phone, but I have this feed that gives me Fox News and Wall Street Journal and MSNBC and CNN, so I get a whole variety. But most people go to the source. It's human nature. It's called confirmation bias. It's human nature to go to the source that you already agree with. And you add to that the social media, and we're just being, well, let me tell you one quick story. In 2016, I went to a kind of forum at the end of the presidential campaign with some reporters who'd covered the campaign for a year or two. And one of them said something that really stuck with me. He said, I've been covering Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump for a year, traveling throughout the country, and I've come to believe that each of them is running for president of a different country.
That's it.
We have people in this country that are in different factual universes. And in my experience, it's very hard to solve a problem if you don't have agreement on the facts.
Yeah, it's true. I've been reading a lot about populism. And the episodes of strong populist sentiment in the United States over the history of this country.
Sure.
What we're going through now is similar, not exactly, but similar to other episodes in American history. I mean, this is.
But we didn't have the internet.
We didn't have the internet.
The internet is an accelerant.
Yeah.
That heightens these differences and allows people who were formerly sort of isolated to get together and reinforce one another.
I'm reading a lot about Huey Long, reading a lot about George Wallace.
Wasn't Huey Long a chicken in every pot or something like that?
Yeah, I think he was. I mean, he was a
Share the wealth.
Share the wealth, and he actually he and Donald Trump have the same approach to things, but the difference is that Huey Long was for the helping poor people, and actually he was not as much of a racist as some of the other politicians in the South. So he was from the left, but he was dangerous. And we've had many dangerous people, and we have to remember Father Coughlin,
from the 30s.
From the 30s, hate. People were angry.
There also was a very conscious and deliberate Nazi misinformation campaign in the U.S. in the 30s, where they actually reached out as far as the U.S. Congress to put misinformation into sort of our public media stream, similar to what the Russians are doing now. It's not. This is not new.
So, in my day, George McGovern was a liberal from South Dakota.
Right.
A prairie liberal,
right.
A farmer liberal, which we used to have. Now we don't have it. Is that because the people in South Dakota are different, their attitudes are different, something's changed with the voters in South Dakota?
I can't really comment. I will say that South Dakota has some pretty good senators right now. They're Republicans, but they're Mike Rounds and John Thune are very capable, thoughtful guys. Mike Rounds is a former governor. I can't mind read what's changed. I think the Democratic Party allowed itself to become identified almost entirely with urban issues and urban concerns, and rural people felt left out, not listened to. We here in Maine, the 2nd District is much more conservative than the 1st District. Donald Trump's carried the 2nd District in both presidential elections.
How did you do in the 2nd District the last time you ran?
I carried it.
You did?
I carried it. Yeah. I think I lost Piscataquis County by a couple hundred votes or something like that.
Yeah.
But I did okay. I think part of it is people want to be listened to, and I think they feel that the Democratic Party was listening to elites and that kind of thing, and they weren't really paying attention. Plus, huge changes have taken place in rural areas. Mills have closed. The economy has changed dramatically, and people are sort of disoriented, and I think that's part of what's going on here.
What's Christian nationalism? Do you have? I'm trying to figure out what Christian nationalism, because that also, from reading history, is a thread in American history. But apparently, according to some of the pundits, it's emerging now.
Well, and again, I'm not an expert, but I think it's the idea that this is fundamentally a Christian nation, that it was established by white people, and that Christian nationalism is, this is a place for Christian nationalists. Interestingly, about a year ago, I talked about the prayer breakfast. I spoke at the prayer breakfast, and my topic was, is America a Christian nation? And I did a lot of digging into the founders and the Constitution, and all the evidence is no. That the framers, Jefferson, for example, I learned a lot. Jefferson was a deist. He believed in God. He did not believe in the divinity of Christ. He did not believe in the Trinity. For the first time, I learned what the word Unitarian means. It means somebody that believes in one God, not the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost.
Yeah.
And so Jefferson was not a Christian, and several of the founders were, but the Constitution's very explicit. There's one place where it says there shall never be a religious test for public office. The First Amendment said there shall be no establishment of religion. That's the first line of the First Amendment. The Congress shall make no law establishing a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The framers were and you go back into the history, there were official churches in the colonies. Virginia, the Church of England, the Pilgrims.
Maryland was a Catholic.
Maryland
church.
was Catholic. Quakers in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
the framers were, one of the things they wanted to get rid of was a national church. That was one of the things they were that's one of the things they were rebelling against. By the way, my tie, these are the signers of the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, wow.
And you can see John Hancock is big letters in the middle.
Yeah.
Jefferson's on here, Adams on here. And a friend gave me this tie, and I got it at the Library of Congress. I came to realize we sort of take it for granted. These people were putting their lives on the line when they signed that document. If they hadn't won the Revolutionary War, they'd all been hung. And but to go back to the point, one of their principles, first line of the First Amendment was, we're not going to have a state religion.
These people were elitists. In those days, they were mostly property owners, mostly educated, and they were educated incidentally by ministers and clergy people who had come, many from Scotland during the Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, to teach in the colonies.
Right.
And so these people, George Washington was about the only one who didn't go to college. And there weren't many in those days who went to college, many people.
Well, I've always thought of the Constitution as a series of concentric circles. The first circle, when the Constitution was passed, the people within that circle who were in power were white male property owners, okay?
Yep.
Then it expanded beyond property owners, and then it expanded beyond, in the 1860s, it included black people with the 14th Amendment. And it wasn't until 1920, Harold, barely 100 years ago, that women were included within that circle. And I've thought of the Constitution as a kind of broadening of the circle to include more people in the power centers of society. We forget. I used to teach at Bowdoin, and my women students were sort of surprised that, Eleanor Roosevelt, when she was a young woman, couldn't vote. And that's something, of course, now we take totally for granted, and it's absolutely as it should be.
I have some very conservative Trumpist correspondents, people I'm friendly with who are Trumpists, and they want to restore America. It's a restoration. And I always say, you want to restore it to what? I mean, I know something about American history, and you've just touched on it. You want to restore it to the good old days when women couldn't vote and blacks couldn't vote? That what we want by restoration?
And seniors lived in poverty, and kids worked in factories. You've
Right.
got to ask when somebody says the good old days, you have to say when.
Yeah.
And if and I once heard one of these folks on television. This was years ago, and he said, "Well, we want to get back to a place where the government only takes 8% of GDP. Right now, it's about 20% for Social Security, Medicare, everything else." And so I went back and did some research. Where were we when we were doing 8% of GDP? The answer is about 1910, and you had no child labor laws, you had no Social Security, you had no health care provided, you had people working 14 hours a day, you had no protections. I mean, this is not a place where, unless you were one of those few people in charge, it wasn't a place you'd want to live.
Well, the people that were in charge and the descendants wish those days were restored.
And by the way, all of those problems were solved by government.
I'm 100% with you. They were solved by government, every single one of them. The government was not the enemy. And it's incredible. Well, you're among the politicians, and it's not a great number, who are interested in history. And
to me, you got to be interested in history. That's what we do.
You're making history.
I told somebody said, "Well, what's your job if this were a college?" I'd say, "I'm majoring in history with a minor in communications."
Yeah, see that, and that's, I think, right on the button. I read a lot about the founding fathers and American history. It's interesting that Madison, who was the leader in drafting the Constitution, said all of what we're doing won't work if politicians are not virtuous.
Yeah.
They learned about virtue. These people were educated in the classics.
Oh, yeah.
So it's ancient Rome and ancient Greece.
Yeah, oh yeah, the debates at the Constitutional Convention were all about, and the Federalist Papers all about Rome and Greece and early Britain and those kinds of things.
Exactly. And so it's essential that the leader, meaning the president, be virtuous, have some sense of virtue. And of course, it was inevitable that they would select who they regarded as the most virtuous, George Washington, to be the first president. And he was the guy who kind of set the tone for the presidency.
And who left voluntarily after 2 terms.
Well, I was going to say...
And I think it was George III who said if he does that voluntarily, he'll be the greatest man in the history of the world.
Was practically unthinkable that a man would give up power and leave. So he set the tone, and we've had good presidents, bad presidents, and in-between presidents ever since.
Sure.
But they all left voluntarily because of what the predecessors had established.
That's right.
And
their view of the damage it would do to the country if they didn't. Richard Nixon famously conceded in 1960 to John Kennedy, although he had an arguable case about the problems with the election, because he said the damage to the country would be too great if he persisted.
Yeah. Those days are gone, and you have many colleagues in the United States Senate who say, that's okay that those days are gone. They're happy. You have colleagues, Senator, who go around selling the notion that Trump won in 2020. Don't you? Well, I don't think any of them believe it, but you may have another view.
Well, my impression is they don't believe it, but there's a tremendous pressure. Again, it goes back to the voters. It goes back to the voters and to the primaries. Again, if you're running in a primary in a red state, let's say, or it could be a blue state, and only 20% of the voters of your party are going to vote. Here's the math, Harold. Here's the math. In Maine, for example, and it's true in most states, you have 30% Republicans, 30% Democrats, and about 40% unenrolled independents. And let's say you have a Democratic primary, because I don't want to just pick on the Republicans. You have a Democratic primary, and 20% of the people vote. So 20% of 30%, 6%. So right now you've got 6% of the people of Maine choosing the Democratic candidate, and let's say there are 3 or 4 candidates, and the winner gets 35%. 30% of 6%, 2%. So the net result is that the candidate of the major party for the U.S. Senate or for governor or whatever is supported by, has the votes of 2% of the people of the state. You were around, the primaries were designed to replace the smoke-filled rooms, be more democratic. The problem is the primaries have now become bigger smoke-filled rooms. And the cure, I believe, is open primaries, like they have at some of the stations, Alaska, California, and Louisiana, they have something called a jungle primary. Anybody can run.
Right.
And the top 4 finishers, whether they're 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, 2 and 2, whatever, they then go on to the general election, and the people in Alaska, they choose by ranked choice voting. Lisa Murkowski is one of the very best members of the U.S. Senate. She would not be there but for the open primary
She was
system.
defeated in a Republican primary.
She was defeated in a Republican primary. She won in a runoff. You know how she did? You know those little rubber bracelets people have?
Yeah.
She made thousands of those with her name on it so people could spell Murkowski when they went in. She won in a write-in.
Yeah.
But this kind of system, I think, is something we really have to think hard about. And Maine has taken a step in that direction by allowing, just this year, independents to vote in primaries.
Yeah. It's it is amazing how things have evolved, and as you say, accelerated by the internet. I want to talk a little bit about the case of the immigration bill in the Senate, and how it was moving along, and then suddenly Donald Trump spoke.
Yeah, but let's go back a little further.
Yeah.
I remember, well, here's the way it played out. The president submitted the Ukraine.
Now, excuse me, can we, I don't want to interrupt, but
Yeah.
can we set the stage for the audience and say, everybody's talking about the need for an immigration bill,
Right.
and the Republicans in Congress were saying there will be
Well,
no aid.
That's what I was just
Okay.
about to point out.
Okay.
The deal was the president submitted the supplemental bill for Ukraine, Israel, Indo-Pacific, and humanitarian back in October, and maybe early November. And my Republican colleagues said, we're not going to take this bill up without border security. We're not going to deal with Ukraine's border until we deal with our border. Okay. So the Republicans appointed James Lankford of Oklahoma, a very conservative guy, the most knowledgeable about the border of anybody in the Senate, in my opinion. They appointed him to negotiate a border bill. The Democrats appointed Chris Murphy, and then Christian Sinema, who was sort of in the middle, got involved. The three of them worked for 4 months, and they really worked at it. This was a tough negotiation. I remember texting James on Christmas Eve and saying, how's it going? And his one-word reply was tired. They worked right through the holidays. They came up with the toughest border bill in 40 years. But I remember coming home and saying to Mary that winter, the question here is whether these folks want border security or do they want the border issue to talk about in November. Well, they did. They got the negotiation. They came up with the bill. People were fired up. We're going to have Ukraine aid. We're going to have a really tough border bill. The Democrats swallowed a lot of things they didn't want to swallow. There was nothing in it about a pathway to citizenship for Dreamers, which the Democrats traditionally had asked for. Very tough conservative bill. And then the former president said, he pretty much explicitly said, I want this issue for November. I don't want Joe Biden to have a victory on the border. And the support in the House and the Senate just melted away and left James Lankford sort of out there in the cold when he had been asked by his caucus to do this. We could have had a border bill. I've supported every border bill that we've had. We could have had one. So the idea that somehow the Democrats are weak on border, the Republicans had a border bill they could have supported. It would be in place now. Billions of dollars for shoring up the border, building the wall where necessary, new technology, more Customs and Border officials, more detention beds, more judges, all of those things was in hand, and it was just blown off.
Yeah, and as you say, nobody got everything they wanted.
Oh, no.
And the Democrats gave up a lot, the Republicans gave up some. But one of the things in the bill that almost everybody that's listening here and everybody in the country agreed with, in that bill was a provision to shorten the time for to adjudicate these cases with these asylum seekers.
So we don't have we don't have them sitting in limbo for months and years.
And unable to work.
That's right.
So that, to me, was something that 90% of the people in America agreed upon, and we couldn't get it done because you call him the former president. I call him Trump, because he said no, and he ordered them. And I don't think we've had, in my lifetime, I don't think we've had somebody out of office, a candidate for office, who's been able to order the members of his party in Congress to do one thing or another. They simply fall in line. They get the message. He says no, they say no.
Excuse me, I'm getting rid of a cold.
Yeah.
It's not power that he has over them. It's power he has over their voters. That's what's going on here.
Yeah, I agree with it. My wife says, why do they fall in line? It's because they understand the first rule of politics, re-election, and they want to stay in their job. And the people that give them their job want them to obey Trump.
Well, and it goes back to this idea that that there's no place for a moderate.
It was amazing what the power that the former president has over them, but as you say, it's their voters. He has control of their voters. But that bill all began with aid to the Ukraine,
Right.
Israel, but specifically, let's talk about the Ukraine. You've been to the Ukraine.
Yeah, I've been several times, but let's talk about history.
Yeah.
To me, this is one of the clearest cases. You know, Mark Twain's famous line, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it usually rhymes. This is one of the clearest cases of that. When people would contact me and say, what about Ukraine? Why are we helping Ukraine? I would say, Google Sudetenland 1938. That was an almost exactly analogous case where Hitler took over this adjacent land to Germany, and the Allies, the French and the British particularly, could have stopped him fairly easily. In fact, he expected to be stopped, and they didn't. I just finished a book called, it's the Fall of the Third Republic. It's about France between the First World War and the Second World War. There's a whole section on this time when they could have stopped Hitler, and they didn't do it. And there's no question that history tells us that dictators don't stop. And I got into a debate with a guy on the street in Bath the other day, a little while ago, and he said, well, Putin's going to stop with Ukraine. He just wants to, take care of Ukraine. It's on his border and everything. My response was, so why did the Finns suddenly decide to join NATO?
Yeah.
The Finns know Russia. They know Putin, and they're vulnerable, and they know it. The same thing with Sweden. I've been to Lithuania, and that's where the people are they're worried, because Putin has said in 2005, he said the worst catastrophe of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He wants to rebuild the Soviet Union. That means Poland, Hungary, the Baltic states. So Ukraine is just the beginning, and that's why this is one of the I think maybe the most important vote I've ever taken, because if we pulled out of Ukraine, it would have emboldened Putin. I think made a war in Europe pretty likely, a reasonable possibility, but it also would embolden Xi Jinping over Taiwan. He's been watching this like a hawk. And my friend Dan Sullivan, who's a Republican senator from Alaska, very good guy, former Marine, he's been saying to his colleagues, deterrence is not divisible. If you fold in Ukraine, you've lost your deterrence in Taiwan and in the Pacific, because Xi Jinping is going to conclude America isn't going to stick up with its allies, isn't going to keep up and keep its commitments, and it makes an invasion of Taiwan that much more likely. Kim Jong-un in North Korea. It's no coincidence, I believe, that in the last several months, since we've been fooling around about whether or not to support Ukraine, Kim Jong-un has been making noises about attacking South Korea and reunifying the peninsula under his control. So, to me, this was all about history. And Maya Angelou once said, if somebody tells you who they are, you should believe them. And Putin has told us who he is.
No question about it.
And so that's why the vote that we recently took to finally provide this aid is so absolutely critical. And again, it was
you had a majority of the Republicans opposing it.
That's right. But we got let's see, I can't remember how many Republican votes. The final vote was 70.
I think you got 22.
78 to 18 or something like that.
You got 22 Republican votes.
Yeah, but they stepped up, and this was a case where they
22 of them stepped up.
No, it was more than that, I think. In the final, just the most recent one.
Okay.
And they were going against the former president in this case. He wanted to pull the plug on Ukraine, and
he likes Putin.
And they said no, we're going to step up here. So that was a strong bipartisan vote. It was a good moment for the Senate.
Yeah, but this is not the first time in American history. You went back to Germany and the Sudetenland, and of course isolation of the Republicans in Congress in the 1930s
Sure.
were many of them were isolationists.
Yeah.
And they did not believe that the war,
Oddly enough, you know what their motto was? America first.
no question about it. I think that phrase was tried and tested and proven helpful to politicians in the 1930s, America first.
Yeah.
And so history repeats itself. So these Republicans were isolationists, and now they're isolationists again. And they do not believe what's happening in Ukraine has anything to do with American national security.
And that's what people said in the 30s, but it has everything to do with American
Everything
national
to do
security.
with it. Now, you're on the Senate Intelligence Committee. We can't ask you, you can't tell us.
I can tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
Yeah, right. So, however, you can talk generally. There is no doubt that, look, it's obvious to anybody who wants to watch. It should be obvious to Donald Trump, who seems to be an admirer of Putin, that the guy's a thug. And
Well, he's a former KGB agent.
he's a former KGB agent. They're killers. And they still kill. He kills all his opponents. They die. They get poisoned.
Right, fall out of windows.
Fall out of windows. I mean, this is all obvious stuff. This guy is a bad guy. Now, you know more than I know, and I'm not going to ask you specifics, but Senate Intelligence Committee here reports about Putin's intention and the intention of the Russians.
Well, we've heard a lot in open setting. I can't say anything I've heard in
Yeah.
a classified setting, but
Yeah.
there's plenty of what they call open source information, which is available to the public generally. The Communist Party of Russia, going back to the Bolshevik Revolution, has always had an international sort of misinformation propaganda arm. And they're certainly doing that in a serious way now. Harold, I've thought about it this way. One of the great strengths of our country is our openness of our society, the First Amendment, free expression, and all of those kinds of things. Our adversaries are learning how to use those strengths against us. Remember the old idea of jujitsu? You use your opponent's strength against them. That's what they're doing. They're taking advantage of the fact that it's so easy to get into the media stream here, particularly now in the day of the internet. And they've got full-time people that are writing stories, misinformation. Often they don't have to create stuff. They just amplify things that other people are saying. But we saw evidence at the Intelligence Committee back when we were investigating the Russian influence in the 2016 election. I mean, they were very actively they're trying to divide us. Their whole thing is to find a crack in our society and turn it into the Grand Canyon. They're trying to divide us one from another because their ultimate goal is to make our system fail. Putin and Xi Jinping are betting that authoritarianism is the way of the future, not democracy. And their whole thing is that our system can't work. It can't make decisions. It's too feckless. It's too cumbersome. It's too complicated. And sometimes I think we're playing right into their hands. But that's the struggle that we're engaged in now is a world historic struggle between authoritarianism and democracy. The idea that all those people are created equal and have an equal right to govern themselves. That's a radical, dangerous notion to guys like Putin and Xi Jinping. They believe only a dictatorship can make the right decisions for their societies in the 21st century. I believe they're wrong, but we have to work really hard to prove them wrong.
So this misinformation campaign, we read about it. Some people deny it, but what gets revealed is, first, Marjorie Taylor Greene actually repeats the Russian line.
And of course it's an open question. I mean, she's probably just repeating things she heard.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, a lot of the things she's hearing are things that Russia is pushing out there.
And where does she hear it?
Who knows? Somewhere online, some friends, I don't know, emails. Who knows where she's getting it? But
It comes ultimately from the Russians.
Yeah, I would prefer to use, I don't like to allege that somebody is a Russian agent. I think that's
Yeah.
a little
Yeah,
strong.
I agree. She's not.
But I think a term may be parallelism, where the Russians are going in one direction, so is she. Because a lot of the things she said, about Nazis being in Ukraine and Zelensky being corrupt and those kinds of things, they're coming, that's the Russian line.
What are these? I'm not talking about her. She's.
Yeah.
I don't think she's the brightest bulb around. But intelligent members of Congress and in the Senate, don't they worry that they're wrong? Don't they worry that when they say, well, that this is a Ukrainian problem, not our problem? Don't they worry that the consequences might be bad and that they'll be shown?
I can't answer that. I don't know what goes through their head. I think they're so convinced of their own righteousness and they're on the right side of their politics in their state or in their district. I really don't know whether they're have any awareness of that. I think some too. And I want to say, Harold, I don't want to be entirely negative because in the last 10 days, we've had two major bipartisan successes, both of which were disapproved of by the former president, but which the Republicans stepped up anyway. One was the renewal of the national security, so-called Section 702, that allows us to chase after foreign terrorists in particular, and the other was the supplemental on Ukraine and Israel and Indo-Pacific. Both of those were bipartisan, and I think that's a good sign. And a lot of the work we've done over the past several years, almost all of it's been bipartisan. The infrastructure bill, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Great American Outdoors Act, the couple of budgets, bipartisan budgets. So there's hope, I guess is what I'm saying. And I think we've got to try to, I don't want your viewers to think it's all negative and that we all hate each other and don't talk to each other. That's not true. We certainly have differences, but a lot gets done, as you know, that the public never hears about, that's positive. A lot gets done by unanimous consent. But, the media likes conflict, and you always see the Chuck Schumer versus Mitch McConnell kind of thing. But in reality, a lot's going on behind the scenes that's not so bad. You look skeptical, but I can tell you it's true.
Well, I'm only skeptical because I think there is a strong strain among elected politicians in America that it's in their interest to say, I don't compromise. I stand my ground.
Which I think is a huge mistake.
Huge mistake. But there is this thing where they think
yeah.
this
Well,
makes
that's what I
them
was
a
saying.
hero.
You can lose your primary because you're willing to compromise.
Yeah.
If you're seen as somebody who will work with the other side, try to solve problems and compromise, you're a dead duck. And that's what worries me because to go back to the James Lankford example, what does that tell his Republican colleagues? Will they take on a similar project in the future, having seen what happens to him? To me, that's sort of an underlying deep concern where we're getting to a place where we have people who are coming to Congress whose principle is to not compromise.
Yes.
And by definition, that means you can't solve a tough problem.
You're in the wrong place because the business of the legislature is to compromise.
That's right.
And it reminds me of one of my right-wing correspondents said to me about the bill, that the border bill. He said, well, it was very defective. Now, he hears that on Fox News or everything, that defective bill. Well, from his point of view, any bill that doesn't have everything that he wants in it is defective and should be defeated. That way you get no legislation.
Which is what we have now.
No solutions to any national problems.
That's right.
It's craziness.
I think it was President Kennedy that said you should never compromise on principle, but never forget the principle of compromise. Pretty good way to put it.
Pretty good line. So What else do you want folks to know?
Well, I think they should know that there are, as I indicated, there are some very good people that are working hard on their behalf. And when the chips are down, as they have been over the last several weeks, we find a way to do the right thing. I'm not sure Churchill actually said it, but the quote that's attributed to him is that Americans will always do the right thing after trying everything else first. And we managed to do the right thing over the last month or so, and I think move the country forward. I would very much like to see us address some of the fundamental problems that are plaguing people in their ordinary lives here in Maine. Housing is a huge example. I mean, we're talking about large, international relations and war and peace, but the cost of housing in Maine is a real problem. The workforce, every business that comes to my office and that I talk to has a problem with workforce. We're down something like 1,000 nurses in our healthcare system in Maine. Nursing homes are closing because they can't get staff.
But what can we do to fix it?
Well, there's no single answer.
I mean, housing is money. Housing is money.
Well, except the thing, I visited some people up in Aroostook County last week who are building these tiny houses in a factory. One thing we have to do is figure out how to lower construction costs. If you stop and think about it, we're building houses today exactly the way they were built 400 years ago. 4 or 5 guys go out to a site, put up the sticks, nail them together. If a Ford were built that way, it would cost $1 million. So I think we have to tackle the underlying cost in terms of how construction is done. Could there be more automation, more work in factories? And it wouldn't take away jobs, it would end up creating jobs. I'm working on a bill, a very bipartisan bill. Marco Rubio is one of my co-sponsors, that would provide no down payment house purchase for first responders, firefighters, police, and then teachers in the community where they serve. And the idea is that it's not a federal subsidy, there's no taxpayer money, but there's a mortgage insurance premium that covers the down payment, that keeps the bank safe, and allows people to get into homes without that big, $80,000, $100,000 nut that is now, because houses are so expensive. Lori LaChance, who you may know, the president of Thomas College, one of the smartest people in Maine, once said, "There's no silver bullet, but there's often silver buckshot." And I've always liked that image. They're not one single solution,
right,
but more support for low-income housing construction, all of their multiplicity of things, redeveloping these properties around Maine that have a big white house that has an elderly couple, put in a couple of workforce apartments in those houses. All kinds of things that we have to work on. We have to work on workforce.
Well, what's the problem? What can we do about workforce? I see low unemployment rate. So apparently,
unemployment rate's historically low.
Yeah.
The problem is we don't have workers. We have a crisis, for example, in mental health workers. There are not enough people to just provide the support. It's not money. It's just there aren't the bodies. There aren't the people that are trained to provide those services.
Well, we have a lot of people that some of them quite talented that want to come to America and be Americans.
That's immigration is one of the ways that historically we've kept our economy afloat and supported our businesses in their growth. As I say, every business in Maine that comes to me wants people. Many of them employ new Mainers, and they're very happy with them because they want to work and they want to contribute. But we have to enforce the immigration laws and make sure it's legal and all of those kinds of things. But we need people, and we need people who are willing to work, and we've got people who are willing to work, but because of peculiarities in the law, Susan Collins and I have had a bill in for 2 years to shorten the period between the time an asylum seeker gets here and the time they can go to work.
Why can't that bill get passed? Your bill?
Because everything involved with immigration is a big deal, and it's all you can't do.
Politicians on the other side want to exploit the issue for some political advantage. That's why.
Harold, I would never argue with you.
But it's true. The election is everything.
Sure.
Everything. There isn't anything else, and I don't think that was true with Madison and Jefferson. Although Jefferson, he got a little rough with John Adams
And Hamilton.
and Hamilton.
But you know, it's an interesting bit of history. Hamilton elected Jefferson president. Jefferson had a tie. There was a tie with Aaron Burr. And it went to the House of Representatives and something like 26 ballots. And Hamilton was Jefferson's blood enemy. Hamilton was a Federalist. Jefferson was this agrarian sort of country, you know, he had a whole different view. And ultimately, Hamilton cast his support in favor of Jefferson because he viewed Burr as so dangerous. He made a decision on behalf of the country, even though it was against his political interests. Really interesting piece of American history.
We're going to wrap up here in a minute or two, and I want to make an observation for the audience. We think it is normal for elected politicians like Senator King to come and talk about his reading of American history, of law, politics, and so forth. We think it's normal because George Mitchell did the same thing. George Mitchell, I always said to people, read books.
Yeah.
Angus King reads books. It's a little out of favor now, and most politicians don't do it. But you do, and George Mitchell does, and that's what makes it a pleasure to have you on this show and to interview you and to have an intelligent conversation. And I think the people, man, I know I probably get in trouble for this because there's an election going on, but there is some uniqueness.
Well, listen, to be mentioned in the same sentence with George Mitchell is pretty humbling. So I'm not going to screw that up. Harold, thank you. It's been great to be with you.
Well, enjoyed it very much. Thank you.